Greetings there, academic proletariat, and welcome to this episode of the Fireside Chats where Mr. Olson comes at you with a baby wrapped around him. And we're going to be talking about Period 6. So this will be our Period 6 review for the AP test and for our Period 6 exam. Just want to remind you there's guided notes that go along with it. They look like this. They're available on Schoology, or if you can't find them there, you can always email me. I just want to remind everybody that the College Board stops Period 6 with imperialism, which sort of begins in 1898, and the College Board very strangely puts imperialism and the Progressive Era in Period 7, which is not what I would have done, not what several AP US history teachers would have done, but we kind of have to go with what they do here. I just want to remind my students at least that your Period 6 exam also covers Period 7A, which includes imperialism and the Progressive Era. So it's not going to be covered in this video, but just know that that'll be on your exam. But pairing this with those two ideas is not necessarily a bad idea or a bad thing to do when studying for the national exam. Okay, so bookend dates, as I just said, 1898 is when imperialism starts. 1865 is when the Civil War ends. One could start this period in 1862 with the Homestead Act, but that's all a matter of preference. So Civil War ends, beginning of American imperialism. Those are our bookend dates. Boom, let's go. Let's talk about the key concepts. So key concepts that we'll be going over today in this video. Key concept 6.1, technological advances, large-scale production methods, and the opening of new markets encourage the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. Key concept 6.2, the migrations that accompanied industrialization transformed both urban and rural areas of the United States and caused dramatic social and cultural change. And key concept 6.3, the Gilded Age produced new cultural and intellectual movements, public reform efforts, and political debates over economic and social policies. So we're talking about industrialization, we're talking about the consequences of it, both ideological and physical. All right, so let's jump right in. Let's do period key concept 6.1, technological advances, large-scale production methods, and the opening of new markets encourage the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. I rewrote that key concept as the second industrial revolution led to more trade and the rise of industrial capitalism. You go ahead and pause me. You rewrite it in your own words, however you think it sounds. Great, go. All right, so key concept 6.1 is broken down into three parts. Key concept 6.1, Roman numeral 1, large-scale industrial production accompanied by massive technological change, expanding international communication networks, and pro-growth government policies generated rapid economic development and business consolidation. So let's start with the pro-growth government policies. We're going to talk about the economic impact of the Civil War. Just want to reiterate that wars generally make governments stronger, and the Civil War was no different. So the Civil War strengthened telegraph lines and sort of created more communication networks. Saw the passage of the Pacific Railway Act, which facilitates a transcontinental railroad, which will come up later in our episode. The National Banking Acts were passed during the Civil War, which promoted a national currency and a national economy, for that matter, and it facilitated corporate growth in that the Union Army and the federal government was buying a lot of stuff, particularly arms and clothing. So the government was stimulating the economy. Not that surprising. If you notice on the graph here, U.S. Industrial Index dramatically increases in the years after the Civil War. It exponentially increases, and that is largely because of the Civil War. Yay! Okay, so to continue, I want to sort of give you an acronym to remember, and I stole this from John Green, so I got to give him the props. But if you want to think of what led to American industrialization, you can always think of it in terms of geography, the fact that the United States has plentiful crops for food, it can feed a large population, and it has plentiful natural resources, particularly coal and oil, both of which were very useful in the Second Industrial Revolution. Second part of our acronym is D, stands for demography. Our influx of immigration and our large surplus labor population allows for there to be a lot of workers and allows companies to keep wages down because there are so many workers willing to go after jobs. And then finally, law. So our acronym GDL, law, refers to the fact that our Constitution is market friendly and the Supreme Court is business friendly. So they interpret laws in the Constitution or words in the Constitution to benefit the businesses, usually at the expense of the workers. We'll talk about that in a second. So to go on with key concept 6.1, Roman numeral 1, technological innovation was on the up and up during the Gilded Age. We were immersed in a fossil fuel revolution in which we saw coal and oil replace water and steam. This led directly into the Bessemer process, which was the process exploited by Andrew Carnegie, which revolutionized steel production, and strong steel was important during this time period because Railroads, of course. So steel, very important. And then finally, this wasn't as material; it was more ideological. But assembly line production really got its start during this time period, and the mass production of goods allowed for the prices of those goods to go down, which changed the way a lot of people lived. In addition to technological innovation, there was also business innovation. So new business practices. We saw the formation of trusts, which were basically a group of advisors that took all their stocks in a certain commodity, put them together, and made decisions about that commodity together. A good example of trust is obviously seen in the jungle when Browns and Durhams are essentially in a trust together. In addition to trust, we have horizontal integration, which is a fancy term for monopolies. It's pictured here. It's best exemplified by Rockefeller Standard Oil Company. That's when a company will buy up all of its competitors within a given market. So Rockefeller would go around and buy up all the other oil companies. And then right along with that, sort of alongside horizontal integration, we see the advent of vertical integration, which is best exemplified by the meatpacking industry in Chicago, which basically takes everything involved in the creation of a given product or commodity and houses it under one company or one person. So Gustavus Swift, Philip Armour, they basically took everything involved in meat packing and they bought it all. They bought the delivery wagons, they bought the meat packing plants, they bought the ranches, they bought the refrigerator rail cars, they bought the ice stations. You've got the idea. Okay, key concept 6.1, Roman numeral 2, a variety of perspectives on the economy and labor developed during a time of financial panics and downturns. So some people liked this industrialization, some people didn't. Let's talk about the two different sides. People who liked it argued that a laissez-faire economic environment, which means little government involvement, was good because we saw real wages increases, which is seen by the graph here. A real wage, of course, is the amount of somebody makes vis-a-vis how much it costs to buy things. So if the price of goods are low and you have a relatively high wage, you have a high real wage. Okay, so some argue that it was a good thing because the price of goods was going down. So since the price of goods, since goods are being mass produced, the prices are going down. Okay, so real wages are going to increase. Standard of living for many Americans actually increases, but at the same time we see an increase in the gap between the rich and the poor because the rich are making a lot of money off of this stuff, and the poor, well, they're kind of getting hosed. So not surprised. Okay, so to kind of vary from the economic norm here, we're going to travel south for a second and talk about industrialization in the southern part of America. And you might remember that Henry Grady coined the term New South, which he argued that the South was going to stop being backward and it was going to manufacture more stuff so that it could be more like the North. It could be a part of this industrial economy. And it sort of sees that in that it manufactures iron ore. There's iron ore deposits in Alabama, and they get heavily involved in the steel making industry because they have that resource. Also, they get into the textile manufacturing business because, as you can see in the picture, there's cotton in abundance in the South. Why not build a textile factory right next door? And the good thing about that too, if you're a textile factory owner, is that Southerners usually work for really cheap because very few of them own plantations, contrary to what Gone with the Wind would want you to believe. And then finally, tobacco, which is also in abundance in the South, is also something that's being mass produced during this time period. Now, despite this new South, and I use air quotes there, the South remained largely agricultural. And if you were poor in the South, you were a sharecropper. You didn't benefit largely from this new industrial economy. Okay, so now let's talk about the naysayers in against industrialization. That would be our workers. So since workers, had poor working conditions, they had poor living conditions, they responded by organizing into unions, and generally the demands of the unions were they wanted to work less hours, which seemingly gives more people jobs because if two people are each have a 12-hour shift, and you could knock the hours down, you give three people 8-hour shifts. That's why they wanted an 8-hour workday. They wanted safer conditions. They wanted higher wages. So there's three main industrial unions that we need to be aware of. The first is the Knights of Labor. They were headed by a man named Terence Powderly. Their goals were they wanted to see government ownership of the means of production. Okay, so they were kind of this quasi-socialist, not Bernie Sanders type of union. They wanted to see the government sort of nationalize the means of production because they thought that it could be better regulated that way. Their membership included unskilled workers. Some skilled workers were involved in this too, but mostly unskilled workers. They allowed blacks into their union. They allowed European immigrants into into their union. They allowed women into their union. They discriminated against Asian populations, but for the most part, they were egalitarian, more so than the union we're going to talk about in a second. Now, their methods, they were not too keen on strikes because they saw strikes as being damaging and that it left a lot of workers out of work, so they wanted cooperation and education instead. Now, a more conservative union was the American Federation of Labor, headed by Samuel Gompers. Their goals were similar to that of the Knights of Labor, but they wanted to work within the confines of capitalism and focus on bread and butter issues: shorter hours, higher pay, safer conditions. Okay, their membership included skilled workers organized by crafts. So if I was a textile worker, I would be in a sort of mini union under the head of the AFL that included textile workers. If I was a steel worker, I would be in the steel workers union that was sort of underneath the AFL. The idea here was that these smaller craft unions could cater to the needs of their specific constituency, but then if there was a strike that went on in within their product making, they could put pressure on the big business by going on strike. Okay, now who was in this union? There were no women. There were very few immigrants. There were very few Black Americans. Yeah, they were not the most egalitarian. And then finally, they were more open to using strikes. The major strike the AFL was involved in is, of course, the Haymarket strike, which was the Homestead strike, which was at a steel plant in Pennsylvania, in a Carnegie steel plant, and of course descended into chaos when the Pinkerton guards were called in, and it just turned out to be really messy. So that's that. Now, the last and my favorite of the unions, of course, is the Industrial Workers of the World, headed by Big Bill Haywood. Their goal was to see public ownership of the means of production. So they wanted the workers to be in command of the factories, and they wanted to destroy private property. So they were more communist, if you will. Their membership, they included all industrial workers, and they used methods like violent strikes, not always intended to be violent, but they usually turn violent because the government was not on the side of labor. And then they were not closed to the idea of sabotaging the means of production. So if there's a bad factory, blow it up. Okay, key concept 6.1, Roman numeral 3. New systems of production and transportation enabled consolidation within agriculture, which, along with periods of instability, spurred a variety of responses from farmers. So we're talking farmers. If we're talking farmers, we're going to talk populists. So farmers had several issues during the Gilded Age and after the Civil War. There was high railroad rates, high storage rates, deflation, meaning the lowering of prices, and that's bad for farmers. They, of course, want to sell their corn for high prices. The bad thing about that is that if there's high corn prices, there's high prices for everybody else. Farmers aren't really quick to realize that. Don't know why. And anyways, poor conditions on their farms leads to lower yields, which means they make less money. Now, their initial response is to unionize, so they're essentially workers from the very beginning. They unionize into groups like the Grange and the Farmers Alliance. Then, once they realize that that's not really going to go anywhere, they politicize themselves and they form a political party called the Populists, or the People's Party. And so their goals are in direct response to their problems. They want to see nationalization of the railroads. They want the government to take over the railroads to regulate them more readily. They want a free coinage of silver, which would combat deflation by adding money to the money supply. This is known as bimetallism, because in addition to silver, they also wanted to back the dollar with gold. They just wanted to, add to the amount of money in circulation. And then finally, they wanted direct election of senators, which would limit corruption in Congress. Now, the populists in the 1892 election, they run a candidate, James Weaver, and he gets 1 million votes, which doesn't really sound like a lot, but it's pretty impressive for a third party, and that America really doesn't have third parties. We're sort of stuck in this whole two-party system. Anyways, in the 1896 election, the populists realized that they might not make it on their own, so they backed the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan, who, of course, becomes most famous for giving his Cross of Gold speech, in which he advocates for the silver standard, or the free coinage of silver, to combat deflation. But in the long run, William McKinley beats William Jennings Bryan, in what some people would call a landslide, mostly because big business funds him. They throw $10 million to the McKinley campaign, and William Jennings Bryan can't compete with that. So all this populist stuff, really for nothing. Kind of sad. All right, anyways, key concept 6.2. The migrations that accompanied industrialization transformed both urban and rural areas of the United States and caused dramatic social and cultural change. I rewrote this concept as because capitalism needs a large pool of labor, many people migrated to industrial centers. Go ahead and pause me and rewrite key concept 6.2 in your own words. Go. Okay, key concept 6.2, Roman numeral 1. International and internal migrations increased urban populations and fostered the growth of a new urban culture. People moved to cities. Here we go. New immigrants were the people who came in large numbers during this time period, mostly from Eastern European countries and Asian countries, so Japan. China towards the earlier part of the Gilded Age, but as you recall, the Chinese Exclusion Act makes it kind of hard for them to come in. But those Eastern Europeans come in large numbers, Lithuania, Poland, Italy, Greece, places like that. So they come to America because they have opportunity and they're willing to work for low wages and do low skill work, kind of like what Jurgis did in the jungle. In addition to new immigrants, Southern blacks are also on the move. They move north into cities. Bigger numbers to come later. Women also move from rural to urban areas, find jobs as in clerical work. Now, as you can probably imagine, because this is America, changing demographics led to a surge in nativism and discrimination against these new groups. So, what do white Protestant Americans form? American Protective Associations, which are basically racist and prejudiced organizations intended at maintaining the status quo. And then, of course, the persistence of the social Darwin theories that we'll come back to later in Key Concept 6.3. All right. So now, when these immigrants come to America, where are they going to go? Well, they can't move to rural areas because there's nothing to do because farm prices are so low, so they move to cities. Now, cities have several advantages. There's several disadvantages too, which sort of get more of the spotlight. So we'll start with the advantages. Political machines, while they're seen of as in a bad light, most of the time helped immigrants because they gave them the necessities for life that immigrants couldn't get anywhere else. So you need a pair of shoes, go see the political machine. All you got to do is vote for them, and they'll give you shoes, they'll give you food, they might even get you a job. So political machines helped newcomers, believe it or not. In addition to that, there's also entertainment and cultural opportunities. You go in the city today, you might go to something like the Field Museum, the Museum of Science and Industry. Those types of things were also around during the Gilded Age. The Field Museum is actually built during the Gilded Age, and it's a place for that people like Marshall Field think that workers can go and escape the drudgery that is their everyday lives on Sundays by having some sort of fun. So it's kind of paternalistic and insidious, but there is something to do at least. And ethnic neighborhoods that popped up with the large numbers of immigrants allowed for immigrants to feel a little bit more at home. There's also work opportunities. There's more jobs in urban areas than there are in rural ones. And then finally, there's social philanthropy, settlement houses. For example, Jane Addams and Hull House, the social gospel movement, which were religious organizations that sought to better the lives of immigrants. There's sort of a safety net there. Now, it's not a government safety net, which it should be, but there's a safety net. Disadvantages of urban housing include tenement houses, pollution, corruption at those political machines. There's a surplus late labor, and there's a lack of shelter and other necessities there as well. Okay, key concept 6.2, Roman numeral 2, larger numbers